All right, Joe, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tavshin Pei Hey, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this year as a zechus for Besaros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev Abba Leil Tova, Josh and Becker Friedman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Josh's father Yisrael Yehuda ben Rav Chaim Raphael, and in the zechus of the safe return of our hostages and the security of all of our soldiers. Sammy and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents Ludwig Stiefel, Sarah Stiefel, and Hinda Esterson, Zichronim Livracha, and in memory of their dear friend, brave soldier and beloved husband and father, skilled physiotherapist Naftali Gordon Hashem Yikom Damo, Naftali Yona, Zichronim Livracha Ben Dani, and Betty Gordon. Betty Gordon Sheyichia, Betty Gordon. Beatty is who? Mother. Okay, Beatty. I got it. Good. Sammy, I need to get also the Hebrew names of all of the parents. I don't have it in the. Okay. And who was killed by sniper fire while in his tank in Gaza on Erev Chanukah on the 24th of Kislev, 5784. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, his neshama will have an aliyah. All of the neshamas will have an aliyah. The families a nechama. And of course, I'm sorry, our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Yehuda Buchwalter, in the schus of welcoming back Tzidkas HaTzadik, Shkoyach again, and Baruch Gold, of now, formerly of Baltimore, now currently of Lakewood, New Jersey, in honor of his 62nd birthday. We wish a very happy birthday, Miras Hashem, to Baruch, who is the schus to be back, Baruch Hashem, in learning of the Rebbe's Torah. We hope that all of the neshamas have an aliyah, the families, Zeinacham, and indeed the Chash Baruch, who brings home all of our hostages and allows our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to, actually really not a lot, still of the shorter dapim now, Baruch Hashem. So we are picking up, today's daf is Kuf Samech Gimel 163. We are picking up on Kuf Samech Beis, Amud Beis 162b. Last line. I suppose. So one of the things that we established in yesterday's daf, and this is very important because this is going to be a little bit of a guiding light. Let's just have to tell you something very beautiful. So here with us on Zoom is Moshe David Artman, who I see over here. The Artman's Baruch Hashem were zocher to have a baby last Shabbos. The little baby, Meretz Hashem Tinok Ben Chana, is Baruch Hashem taking his time integrating into this world. He's currently in the NICU, but Baruch Hashem making beautiful progress. Moshe David is in the NICU right now, learning Daf Yomi with his son. I said these things, number one, because they're inspirational. Number two, because whatever excuse you think you have, right? Moshe David now officially deflated, took the wind out of the sails of any excuse that you could possibly come up with. And I want to say, but just understand what it means to be a Yid. What it means to be a Yid is that what happens when your baby is in the NICU? What happens? You bring your Gemara to the NICU. That's it. Who could imagine the zchuyos that this little baby has, that he has a father who's there? Moshe David, you should take off the headphones. Let the baby hear what's going on over here. It's probably a public space. I realized afterwards. Okay. But incredible. Amiras Hashem, we give the Armins a bracha that their baby should have just a complete and enduring refuah, which Amiras Hashem he will have. B'sha'ah tova u'metzlachas, he should enter into briso sha'avnu avinu bizmano. Parents should be zocha l'gal Torah l'chuppah l'maisim tovim, and halavai he should be zocha Amiras Hashem to learn the daf with his sons as well. Amiras Hashem b'shalom and b'karav. All right, to both say, incredible. All right, the Gemara says as follows. The last line of Kuf Samech Beis Amud Beis. Ibailahu. Gemara asks a question. So remember again, in yesterday's daf, we outlined a very important concept, which is Ein Lameid Davar Mishita Achrona. We do not go ahead and learn anything from the last line of a document, which means we leave that line blank. Now the truth is, as we saw, we don't leave it blank. What do we do with it? We go ahead and we do a summary. So the idea over here is, now let's say what we also saw, so therefore, if you have now remember, we use it as a summary, but if you didn't use it as a summary and it's blank, what's halacha? Shtar is kosher. It's fine. At what point does blank space end up going ahead and creating a psul? 2 lines. right? When you have two lines, which now makes sense because it's not really two lines; it's really one line, right? It's the line above the bottom empty line that creates problems. So now the Gemara asks an interesting question. The two lines that we spoke about, the two lines that create an invalidation of the shtar, top of Kuf Samech Gimel, Hein va'aviran, or Dilma Hein v'lo aviran. So I'll say this is interesting. When we speak about two lines, we'll literally translate, is it two lines, avir means airspace, is there two lines including the space between lines, or just two lines without the space between lines? Now take a look at the top Rashbam on 163a, Kuf Samech Gimel on Dalat, Hein va'aviran, Shir Ksivas Hashitin, Va'avir Chalak Ben Sayim Nifsal, Aval Pachos Mikan Eno Nifsal. So we'll say, now listen to this. Remember, when you have two lines of text, right? Two lines of text. So two lines of text are not just two lines, one on top of the other. By definition, when you are writing a shtar, at least the way shtars are written, there was always a space in between lines, right? Now we're going to talk about this. Why is that? Why do you need a space between lines? Because remember, in Hebrew you have sophist letters, right, and lamids, right? So sophist letters and lamids. So sophist letters, remember again, extend downwards, and a lamid extends upwards. So therefore, by definition, whenever you were going ahead and writing something, you never had two lines crunched together. You always had two lines and some amount of space in between the lines. Whether or not it's an actual skipped line in the middle, we'll talk about, but the point is there's space. So the Gemara has an interesting kasha. When we say that two lines of empty space invalidates in a shtar, what's the shear, right? We need a shear. Everything in halacha is shiurim. I need a shear. How much is two lines? Is it just literally what would be two lines of text without any, we'll call it, I'm just going to use the word airspace. What's the word? Not airspace, is, I would say blank space, but it's all blank space. In between the line space, right? Is it just two lines without in between the line space or with in between the line space? Good, that's the shayla. So Rav Nachman says it makes sense to say that it must be two lines plus the necessary airspace. Right, plus the necessary airspace in between the lines. These are the hein v'lo aviran, because we'll say if we just think that it's just the lines themselves without the in-between airspace, so the Gemara says, then shita achas b'lo avira l'may chazia. Then I will say one line by itself, right? So even talking about leaving one line blank, that we don't know anything from the bottom line, leaving one line blank without airspace, what good is one line without space before it and after it? And I was about to say, a line without the space before it and after it is meaningless. You can't do anything with that line of text. So in the same way that we say, Ein lemid in Mishita Achrona, we learn nothing from the last line of the text, and therefore again we leave it blank. So the only way that works, the only way that's meaningful is if you're leaving space, bepashtos, before and after the line. That's what we think. We'll challenge that in just a moment. So too the two lines that we're talking about must have their airspace along with it as well. Okay, alav shmamina, hein va'aviran shmamina. So we say, therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, it must be that when we speak about the two lines, again, remember again, it's two lines that invalidate the shtar. So I must say, when we speak about the two empty lines of space, the two empty lines which invalidate the shtar, it must be that amount of space are the lines themselves, including the airspace as well. Okay, fine, shmamina. And I will say that is indeed the halacha. Let's take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. The Rashbam is almost right across on the right hand side in the short lines, three lines. In shir sheet and sha'amru, b'shir ksav yedei edim shuyos. Oh, sorry, not yet. Good. So we'll say so that's halacha number one for today. We're going to knock out a lot of stuff today. So number one is we know two empty lines of space on a shtar invalidate the shtar. The size of those lines is not just two lines, but rather again it's two lines and the corresponding blank space in between the lines as well. Beautiful. Next, Rav Shabsi. Rav Shabsi says name of Chizkiah. Shnei Shitin Sha'amru. Going back to these two lines that invalidate a shtar. B'ksav yedei edim v'lo ksav yedei sofer. Okay, so I will say. So this is very interesting. So those two lines ultimately again are really this is talking about now the width of the line. The width of the line is large enough to accommodate handwriting of regular people, he calls it handwriting of witnesses, and not handwriting of a sofer. Now, what does this mean? So if you notice, by the way, right, sofrim, I tell you where I learned this firsthand, the first time. So I was asked to be a witness on a get. So, right, when you go ahead and you sign on a get, you sign like in Ksav Ashuras, right? You sign like the way things are written in a Sefer Torah. So what's interesting is, so it sounds like, okay, not a big deal, right? You could just go ahead and just sign. Or okay, somebody has to model it for you, you could copy it. The hardest part is writing the letters as small as a sofer writes the letters. It's not replicating the script or the print, right? It's the size of it. So what's interesting is as follows. So the assumption is sofrim, right, and a sofer is drafting a document, writes in a much smaller font than a regular person. Or you'll sign this sometimes when people are signing a ksuva. Now, granted, it's two different scripts we used, right, for what the ksuva is written in, and ultimately how the Eidim sign. But Bipashtos, regular people sign in a much larger font than a sofer is writing. So this is very interesting. Reb Shapsi says in Bechizkiah, Reb Shapsi says that the two lines that we talk about, the two lines of empty space that invalidate the shtar, the width of those lines is wide enough to accommodate the handwriting of what he calls Eidim, which means regular people, and not narrow enough for sofrin. Right? That's what it is. It's wide enough. So the Gemara says, "V'lo ksavi de sofer," and not for the sofer. My timer. So I'll say, just explain to you what this means is what it sounds like it's saying is like this: that if there are two lines of space that are left, but the lines are thin, so that only a sofer could write text in there, that would not invalidate the shtar. It's only if the lines are wide enough that a regular person could write something in there, that's what invalidates a shtar. Now, my time, what's the reason for that? But I will say, because why? What are we concerned about when it comes to two lines of empty space? What are we concerned about? Forgery. I will say, Bipashtos, who's forging the shtar? Or I say better, who's not forging the shtar? The sofer, right? No one's going over to the sofer. Listen, hey buddy, let me slip you a couple extra shekel and do me a favor and just write something else in this line. That's not usually how forgeries are working. Usually, again, what's happening is the sofer is delivering a finished product and someone else is tampering it with it afterwards. So the only time someone's really going to tamper with it is if the line is wide enough to accommodate writing of a regular person. But if the only way to write on that line is by employing a sofer is not going to, the assumption is the sofer is not really going to capitulate. He's not really going to participate ultimately in this act of erroneous behavior, and therefore Allah L'maaseh won't go ahead and invalidate the shtar. So we'll say it's really very interesting. So now we keep on adding on different details. So we ultimately now see it's two lines of empty space, and it's two lines of empty space with the corresponding blank space in between the lines, and now the lines have to be wide enough for a regular person to write, but if they're so thin that only a sofer can write in there, it would not invalidate the shtar. So fascinating. Take a look at the Rashban for just a moment. My timer called the Mizayif Lav Lagabe Sofer as least literally if somebody wants to forge the shtar or temper the shtar, they're not going to the sofer. So the Gemara says, Ulai lo yovelo velo yishma elav la uri nafshe. Because also remember again, if a sofer gets involved, now you say to yourself, I will say, if a sofer gets involved, why wouldn't a sofer tamper with the shtar? Right? Why wouldn't a sofer be a party to this? I will say now, by the way, it's not because of some higher moral ground. It's because this is a sofer's business. And if it gets out that he's into shtar tampering, then what happens? He's going to lose his parnasa. He goes on, Ella ose betzina b'soch beso. So he's going to manipulate the shtar. So one of the parties is going to manipulate it. So the only time really, right, the only way to really tamper with the shtar is one of the parties to the shtar is going to do it. The parties to the shtar are not so from themselves. They don't know how to write like a sofer, and therefore the only way for them to manipulate it is in larger print, larger text. Fine. So the Gemara says, V'kama. So now the Gemara asks, so at the end of the day, so now what we've established is you need two lines of space, right? Two lines of space. The lines themselves have to be wide enough that a regular person could write in it, right? And there also has to be corresponding blank space in between the lines so as to allow for writing. So now the Gemara says, okay, so in total, how much blank space are we talking about that would invalidate the shtar? So the Gemara says, the Kamal. Amar Yitzchak ben Elazar, Kigon, L'cha, Ze al gabe ze. Supposed to listen to this, it's very interesting. So it would have to be enough space to write L'cha, one word, one L'cha on top of another L'cha. They're both saying, this is interesting. Now, what happens if you were to line up two lachas, one on top of the other? So remember, I will say, what does that essentially mean? That effectively becomes like 4 lines, right? Why? Because you've got the top lamed that extends upwards, right? The top ches, right? Ches sofis, that chav sofis, sorry, that extends downwards. Right? Then on the bottom line, on the second line, you have the lamed, second lamed that extends upwards, right? And ultimately, again, the second chav sofis that extends downwards. That's what happens if you were to put a lacha on top of a lacha. Alma kasavar shnei shitin ve'arba avirin. So it turns out that ultimately, again, it's 2 lines with 4 corresponding blank lines in between. So it's 1 blank line above, 1 blank line below for the ches sofis of the top lacha, then the next blank line for the lamed of the second lacha, and then another blank line for the chav sofis, of the second lacha on the bottom. So essentially, according to this approach, it would be really. It doesn't have to be a complete line underneath each of the lines of the text, but enough for the lamed and the sofis chafs, right? Then the chafs to be able to extend down. That's the idea over here. So therefore, it turns out he calls it 2 lines and 4 air spaces. 4 air spaces, or really 4 blank spaces. Okay? Rav Chia bar Abi Amr Mishmei De'ula Kegon Lamid Milamala V'chaf Milamata. So Rav Chia bar Ami holds a little bit differently. He holds that the 2 lines that we talk about are really ultimately, again, enough for a lamed to extend upwards and a chaf sofis to extend downwards. Alma kasavar shnei shitin shlosha avirin. He says really it's 2 lines, 2 blank lines, with 3 corresponding blank spaces. Okay. Rabbi Avao Amar Kigon Baruch. This is interesting. Rabbi Avao Amar Kigon Baruch ben Levi b'shita achas. He holds ultimately again that what does it mean? It's enough space to write a Baruch ben Levi on 2 lines, on 1 line. Sorry. I will say now what happens when you write a Baruch ben Levi this is interesting. So now here you can see it actually in print. What happens when you write a Baruch ben Levi? You've got the chav sofis of Baruch that extends downwards, and the lamed of Levi, which extends upwards. So what does this mean? Kasavar, shita achas u'shnei avirin. It's really ultimately, again, essentially 2 lines really means 1 line with 2 corresponding blank spaces, 1 above it and 1 below it. Okay, so just interestingly enough, now we come to really our first point of machlokes, which is interesting because up until now, everybody was on the same page, because now that we've established that the empty space, right, the empty 2 lines is not just empty 2 lines, but rather, again, it's the corresponding blank spaces that go before and after text. How much is that all together? That's a machlokes. Okay, says the Gemara. Amarav, here we go. Amarav lo shono ela bein edim l'ksav. So this is very interesting. So Rav comes along and says as follows: when do we hold that 2 blank spaces, right, two lines of space, shnei shitin, 2 blank lines of spaces, invalidate a shtar? That's only when the blank space is between the edim and the ksav. So you have the text of the document, and then the witnesses sign after the text of the document, right? So now the problem is if I leave blank space in between the end of the text and the signatures of the witnesses, what could happen? Someone could fill in additional information over there. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. The Rashbam says, Amrav lo shanu, shnei shitin depasu ela imkein herchik beina edim l'shtar. Actually, let's actually go back to the Gemara. So shana ela beina edim l'ksav. Aval, bein edim la'asharta afilu. Listen to this. But I will say, let's say I have an asharta. Now, what's an asharta? Asharta, also known as a handpick, right? A certification, which means this document was certified and upheld in Beis Din. Okay, Beis Din authenticated it. So I will say, so now listen to this. So Rav says, when is there a problem of blank space? Only between the text and the signatures of the witnesses. But if you have blank space between the signatures of the witnesses and the certification, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. Right? That doesn't bother us. That's kosher. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Ma'ishna ben edim liksav dilma mezayif. V'kasav my deboy v'chasim misadi. So let's go back. Let's analyze this. Why is there a problem of leaving blank space between the end of the text and the signatures of the witnesses? So that's obvious. What are we concerned about? Someone's going to write an additional text over there, and the problem is you have the signatures of the witnesses right there. So the problem just is it's going to look like the witnesses are attesting to the authenticity of whatever it is that you add in. 1 second. If there's blank space between the signatures of the witnesses and the certification, right? The asharta, the handpick, the authentication, there's also a problem. You could also doctor this document. How? Watch this. So the Gemara says, "V'kasamai debai." So what can you do? I'll tell you what I could do. If there's blank space between the signatures of the witnesses and the certification, here's what I could do. I can lop off the entire top part of the shtar. Right? Cut off everything from below the signatures of the witnesses and above. Then what do? Write whatever you want. Forge signatures of witnesses, and what do you have in that document? What do you have there? You have a handpick, you have an asharta, you have a certification. In other words, if there's space, we'll see here what's happening over here. We're afraid that we say the halacha l'maisa, if there's too much space as defined by 2 lines between the end of the text and the signatures of the witnesses, that invalidates the shtar because you can write whatever you want in that empty space, and it looks like it's valid because it's coming from the signatures of the witnesses. But the Gemara said, but if there's space between the signatures of the witnesses and the certification, the handpick, that's fine. Why? If there's blank space before the handpick, before the certification, that's terrible. You can lop off the entire part of the shtar, write whatever you want in the blank piece, forge the signatures, and the whole thing will look valid. Why? Why? Because you have an asharta on that document. Right? Well, so that's even worse, right? Because once something has been certified in Beis Din, it's beyond reproach. So you could essentially write up an entire new document. Granted, you'll have to forge the signatures of the witnesses also, but not a big deal because you've got that handpick, you've got that asharta right on there. To which the Gemara says, no, dimitayitle. It's not a problem, because when there is blank space between the signatures of the witnesses and the certification, we fill in that part with ink. We blot it out with ink, right? And we just go ahead and... Oh, so by the way, a couple of people asked, Daniel Golfaz actually mentioned this to me yesterday. He's like, again, a lot of times with blank space, what we could just do is we could just go ahead and make a line, which is what we do, for example, today in a ksuva. In the ksuva, so let's say again, a lot of times, especially if you buy like a pro forma ksuva, so there's a lot of space that's left there. So let's say you don't need all that space for the chassan's name or for the kala's name or for anything else. It's important that what we do is we draw a line. We draw a line through that so that no one should be able to go ahead and write anything else on there. So the Gemara says, not a problem. If there's space in between the signatures of the witnesses and the certification, not a problem. We just go ahead and blot it out. We fill it in with ink. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, so why not go ahead? So if that, so Gemara's like, hello. So if that's what we're doing, that we're filling in blank space with ink, then why don't we do that on the top part of the shtar also, in the space between the text and the signatures of the witnesses? We're spending all of this time speaking about blank space. Why not just say, whatever blank space there exists in a shtar, fill it in with ink and be done with it? So it's interesting. Amri, because here's the problem. Amri sahadi atiyutahu dechasimi. All right, so this is interesting, because what are we concerned about? We're concerned that people will say, what are the witnesses attesting to? What are they signing on? They're signing on the ink patch. Now I'll say, this will make sense in just a moment. The Gemara says, okay, if that's the case, when you fill in the blank space with ink, before the right between the witnesses' signatures and the certification, why don't we say that Beis Din is certifying the ink patch as well? To which the Gemara says, Beidina atiyut lo chasimi. A Beis Din doesn't certify an ink patch. Now, what does this mean? So Rashbam points out here something very important. Now, say, how intelligent do you have to be a witness? Not that intelligent. In other words, you don't. In other words, that halacha l'maisa, being an aid, it's interesting. What it requires is credibility, not intelligence, right? So in other words, what you have to do is you have to have a cheskes kashrus, right? So you have to be an upstanding individual. it does not require that you are intelligent. So therefore, again, witnesses, and it's essentially, again, we're talking about like witnesses on a Reuven's lending Shimon $10,000. So again, he just needs someone to witness it. So who is he grabbing? Who is he grabbing? He could be grabbing someone off the street. Again, a Yid has a cheskes kashrus. That's what we assume over here. So halacha l'maaseh, again, when it comes to witnesses, if there's a patch of ink, sometimes someone really doesn't know what's going on. They're signing, and there's a concern that maybe they're signing that, oh yes, that is a fantastic patch of ink, right? I saw Reuven make that patch of ink. By a certification is only done by Beis Din. Beis Din is intelligent, Beis Din knows what it's doing, and therefore, again, there's no concern that one is going to say, oh, the certification is on the patch of ink. That's ridiculous, because Beis Din ultimately, again, is intelligent individuals. Okay. The Gemara says, so what we have over here is as follows. So remember, what is Rav highlighting to us? Rav is highlighting over here that the only time that blank space is really problematic is between the shtar and the witnesses. But if there's blank space between the witnesses and the certification, the handpick, the asharta, that's not a problem. Now what we've additionally seen is that Allah Chalamaisa, what are you doing with the blank space between the witnesses and the certification? You're filling it in with ink. Okay, so the Gemara says, 1 second. So the Gemara says, 1 second. This is incredible. So now, fine. So you think you've solved the problem by filling in the blank space between the witnesses and the certification with ink. Why shouldn't we be concerned with the following? Someone's going to cut off the shtar right below the signatures of the witnesses. Lop it off. Erase the ink and write a whole shtar on it. Write a shtar on it, forge the signatures of the witnesses, and you have a certification right there, and they have a totally certified fraudulent shtar. Why don't we be concerned about that? The Gemara says, after all, v'amarav shtar habba hu ve'edav alamacha kasher. Rav paskins that Allah l'maisa, if someone presents a shtar, and it's clear the shtar was erased, but it's written and it has witnesses on it, right? Rav holds that the shtar is a kosher shtar. So even though you filled up the blank space with ink between the signature of the witnesses and the certification, this is still an exploitable shtar. Abed Bezer Bosai. Klif Sam Gilman Beis 163b, to which the Gemara says, Hani Rav Kahana, the Masnila Mishmei the Shmuel Shapir. So according to Rav Kahana, ultimately again, who establishes this according to Shmuel, this makes sense. Take a look at Tab Rashbam. Kof Samakimah Beis. Hani Rav Kahana the Masnila Laha Duhu Ve'edav Ala Machak Mishmei the Shmuel. So both say, interestingly enough, there's a machlokes of attribution, right? This statement that if you go ahead and you write a shtar on an erased parchment with witnesses, that it works. So again, interestingly enough, so Rav Kahana attributes it not to Rav, but to Shmuel. Then the universe is in perfect equilibrium, right? Why? Because Rav is the one who's saying that we fill in the space between the witnesses and the certification with ink. And therefore, why? Because Rav would hold that a document written on erased parchment is not good. Shmuel says it is good. However, El Rav Yomi, the Masna B'Shmei de Rav, Ma'ikal Meimar. But according to Rav Yomi, who holds that it is Rav, the Rabbi say Rav seems to be contradicting himself, right? Because Rav said, how do we deal with blank space in between the signatures of the witnesses and certification? Ink it. Yeah. But then Rav also says that what? If somebody presents a shtar that's written on erased parchment, right? The shtar is kosher. Then Rav's contradicting himself. Then how does inking it help? Because the shtar is still tamperable, because what could someone do? Lop off the top parts right below the signatures of the witnesses, erase the ink, write on it, forge the signatures, and you've got a certification right there. So how is inking it helping it? Good. So the Gemara is Michael Neymar, Kasavar, Kolki is very interesting. Kasavar, Kolki Agavna, in Mekaimin Osamin Asharta Shava Elamina Edim Shavo. So this is very interesting. So Rav, according to this approach, Rav will say, if you present a document that is written on erased parchment, and I will say, so you come to Beis with a document that has erased text, right? Document, the parchment is erased, and so the text and the signatures of the witnesses are written on the erased part of the document, and the certification is on a non-erased part of the document. Rav says, the document is kosher, but it raises suspicion, and we will certify it. But we will not rely on the certification that's there. We will certify it based on finding the witnesses. So essentially, Rav says, as much as if you present a shtar like this, we won't summarily dismiss it. But Lamaisa, we also won't simply rely on the asharta that's there. We'll certify it based on the signatures in the document. Well, essentially what Rav is saying is, it says, they say, we're dan lekaf zuchus, not dan lekaf shtus. Like, in other words, when somebody shows up in a beis din, and part of the document is on erased parchment, and part of the document is on non-original parchment, that raises a red flag. So again, Rav is not going to say we're not going to automatically throw it out, but we're also not simply going to rely on the certification that is on the document. Okay? Incredible. So we'll say, so ultimately, I just want to point out, so therefore what's happening according to Rav is like this. According to Rav, the only time that blank space is going to pose a problem is when it's, according to the Gemara, is when it's between the text and the signatures of the witnesses. But if you have a certified document and there is blank space between the signature of the witnesses and the certification, the handpick, the asharta, Rav says that does not invalidate. But what do we do with that space? We fill it in with ink. Now, does filling it in with ink make the shtar totally untamperable? No. Because what could happen? Somebody could cut off the shtar right below the signature of the witnesses, erase the ink, write a new document, forge signatures, and they have an asharta on it already. The Rav says, you're right, you could do that. But if you show up in Beis Din with a document like that, we're not relying on the certification. We're going to certify the document based on this. We're going to track down those witnesses. And certify the transaction based on those witnesses. Okay, beautiful. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Lo shanu ella bein ha'edim l'ksav. So Rabbi Yochanan says, furthermore again, when is there a problem blank space? Only between the witnesses and the text. Aval ben edim la'asharta afilu shita achas pasal. So also Rabbi Yochanan vehemently disagrees with Rav. Whereas Rav said the only time that blank space really poses a problem is when between the text and the witnesses. So comes along Rabbi Yochanan says no. When do we say that ultimately, again, text is empty space is a problem? Empty space is a problem between text and witnesses. But again, even there, how much space is a problem? 2 lines. But space between the witnesses and the certification, even 1 line of space will invalidate the document. Okay, incredible. So much more chamor. Afilu shita achos pasal. So Gemara says 1 second. Ma'ishna gab bein edim la'asharta. So what are we concerned about? Why so machmir? Between the witnesses and the certification? Dilma gayis li'iloi because of hu ve'eda b'shita achas. So this is very interesting. Because what are we concerned about? We're concerned that maybe what's going to happen? Somebody's going to lop off the top part of the shtar, and what? Write an entire document hu ve'eda b'shita achas. Write a document and sign the witnesses all on 1 line. Right, so essentially, imagine for a moment you have 1 line of empty space between the signature of the witnesses and the certification. Somebody will lop off the entire part of the top part of the shtar that leaves you with one line, right? And you write the document, very small, obviously, the document, and sign the witnesses all on 1 line, and then right below it you have the asharta, the certification. So it says, obviously, this is interesting. So according to this opinion of Bosai, he holds that if you write a shtar and sign the witnesses all on 1 line, the shtar is kosher. So that's what he's concerned about, which is quite fascinating. So you take a look at the Rashbam, Kasav Rabbi Yochanan, it's in the white lines, about 10 lines up from the bottom. Kasav Rabbi Yochanan, Shtar haba lefaninu b'shita achas ve'idim b'shita achas tachta. I'm sorry, no, that's not yet. Sorry. So the Gemara says, Shtar haba hu ve'idim b'shita achas kasher. Ihachi bein edim l'ksav nami dilma gai. So we'll say if that's the case, then 1 second, then the truth is empty space, even 1 line of space between the text and the witnesses should also invalidate the shtar, because what could he do? He could lop off the entire text part on top, right? I'm sorry. So also then the same thing should happen over here, that you should be able to lop off the text and write the entire shtar and sign the witnesses all in 1 line. Kasavar shtar habahu b'shita achas ve'eda b'shita acheres puzzle. So say, so no. He holds, interestingly, this one says fascinating. So apparently he holds like this. If you get everything in one line, the shtar is kosher. But if you get everything in two lines, right, literally again, shtar abba hu b'shita achas, ve'ida b'shita acheres, so which is the document, right, the text in one line, and ultimately, again, the witnesses on a separate line, that's puzzle. That's puzzle. The Gemara says, so if you look at the Rashbam, that's Chasav Rabbi Yochanan. The Rashbam says, Rabbi Yochanan, Shtar ha'bal lefaninu b'shita achas ve'idin b'shita acheres tachta puzzle ki the precious taima mishum de'im lemeidin b'shita achrona. So I'll say, this is fascinating. This is fascinating. Why? What's the concern over here? Because the concern is if the witnesses are on the last line, then it's invalid shtar. Why is it invalid shtar? I'll say, why? We don't learn anything from the last line. Now, how that reconciles with what was just said before, we'll have to see. But so if you were to go ahead and write a shtar on one line, witnesses on the last line, and then again, that would not work. Why? Because lemaisa again, that's ein lemeidin mishita achrona. Okay. V'leichash dilma kasav hu ve'eda b'shita achas. So maybe why don't we be concerned about the following? Maybe halacha lemaisa. He could claim, right, maybe indeed he could claim that he wrote the text and the idim on one line, and then what happens? And the other witnesses are just there because he claims, you know what, I like idim, and I just wanted to add on more idim to my shtar. Kasavar, kol ki gavna ein makaimin osa min ha'edim shalamata, ela min ha'edim shalamala. It's interesting enough, he would say in this kind of case, or osai, where we are fearful that someone is adding on additional witnesses that may or may not exist. When we establish the shtar, we establish it based on the earlier signatures and not on the later signatures. Right? So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to pick up, so we have to be mavar Rabbi Yochanan a little bit more, right? So, but essentially what we end off with is a fundamental machlokes in Rav and Rabbi Yochanan about space between the witnesses and the certification. Rav says space between the witnesses and the certification does not invalidate the shtar, but just fill it in with ink so that you can't. So at least it ameliorates the concern of tampering. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Space between the witnesses and the certification is a shtar killer, and even one line of empty space in between the signatures and the certification will negate the validity of the shtar. So again, more Rabbi Yochanan and halacha l'maaseh miras Hashem tomorrow. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a wonderful day, everyone. Moshe David, give that baby a hug for us. Kenai Nahara. Beautiful.